nicely with our next speaker, Tenia Kyriazi, who is the author of the chapter on trafficking human beings in the tourism industry.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you to the editors. You have been very accommodating, because to be honest, you know, legal researchers, sometimes they want to expand their horizons and, you know, be invited in other disciplines to offer their contribution. And we see a wall usually because our way of conducting research is different, and we rarely conduct empirical research, so we are perceived as a very different kind of animal. So we're not very much, I don't know, welcome. So thank you for welcoming me and for giving me the chance to be with you. Because I also think that, as Stroma mentioned, this is a topic that this is a book that gives, you know, a very good coverage of the scope of the topic, but also a different, it also gives the possibility to different methodologies, research methodologies to be present. And that's also of a certain value, because, you know, it introduces us to each other and it opens everyone's horizon. So only this, I think, it's of an extreme value. So a little bit of a background for me. I did my PhD on trafficking in human beings under the human rights perspective, or the human rights perspective on trafficking in human beings, and that was completed in 2010, when still 2010, when still trafficking was perceived as a criminal activity. Was perceived and was addressed as a criminal activity. So, and that is also evidenced through the legal approach to trafficking until that time. And then slowly it started shifting, and everyone started acknowledging that trafficking is not just a criminal activity, but it is a serious human rights violation. And then it started being associated, or is being recognized as a modern form of slavery. So all of these dynamics, all of these developments happened around that time, so between 2005 and onwards. So in this chapter, I look at trafficking in the tourism industry. And thank you for mentioning a little bit of my, you know, my argument here is that, you know, not all sex tourism is trafficking. There is a lot of overlapping, and there's a lot of overlapping between trafficking and sex tourism with minors, but it's not completely identical. So I'm going to make some, you know, I'm going to give some definitions, and I'm going to try to explain how is that different. But I look at trafficking and the prevalence of trafficking, and we've seen that the research shows that with the growth of tourism, we have a parallel growth of trafficking. And we see that in two ways. First of all, we have more and more cities and spots and areas around the world that are becoming sex tourism destinations, and those are more and more. And also that is particularly prevalent when we talk about, you know, mega events, sports events, big conference expos, and all of those. And then on the other hand, we see that the infrastructure of the tourism sector is used as a platform by traffickers. So we see, for example, there was a study in 2018 that was from a US organization that's called Polaris, that is working, that is doing a lot of anti-trafficking research, and they published that from 75% of trafficking in human being survivors were exploited in the hospitality industry, in the context of the hospitality industry. So either, you know, in hotels or in bars, or in touristic places, etc. So that goes to show how much tourism is involved. I mean, without intention, obviously, but it is involved, so it offers a platform. Why does it offer a platform? You mentioned earlier the online agents. Extremely good point, and we see that the online agents, a lot of the trafficking happens through those online agents. Why? Because they offer anonymity, they offer confidentiality. So that's one point that is there. And this is why traffickers prefer, and this is why traffickers are supported by the tourism and travel industry and its infrastructure and its operational network. And with the growth of online technology and digital technology, that becomes even worse. So a few definitions. So where do we find the legal definition of trafficking in human beings? We find it in the UN protocol on trafficking. I'm not going to give you the full title because it's too long and doesn't serve any purpose. So there was an anti-trafficking protocol that was supplementing the UN Convention against organized crime that was signed and adopted in 2000, in the year 2000 in Palermo, Italy. So there was the convention and there was the protocol that was supplementing the convention. And that goes to show you what I already talked about, how trafficking was perceived as a criminal activity and was addressed in the legal, in international law as a criminal activity. So it was supplementing the convention against organized crime. It was not a human rights convention. But nevertheless, it gives us a very, very useful definition that has been accepted over the years and has not been contested in the legal world at all. So trafficking has three elements. It has the element of the action. It needs an action, which is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, and so on. There's a few verbs there that qualify for this action. It requires means. So the means are the use of force or threat or fraud or abuse of power or abuse of a relationship of vulnerability. These are the means. And then it has to have a purpose. The purpose has to be the exploitation of sexual or labor services or any other services for that matter. Now there's a disclaimer there in the definition that says that if you have consented, then that do not qualify as trafficking. But there is another disclaimer that says that minors, consent that has been given by minors is not valid, right? And there is a debate in the legal world when this consent is valid. Is it, for example, do we perceive as valid consent if the victim or the person giving the consent had no other realistic alternative? So that is a big debate that is happening on the side about, yes, there is consent may take away the unlawfulness of the act of trafficking, but when is that consent valid is another question and another debate there. So as I said, we have a lot of overlapping between sex tourism and trafficking, but irrespective of whether that's acceptable, ethically, legally, no, legally it is acceptable, but I mean, whether it is acceptable ethically, socially, anthropologically, and so on and so forth, there are ways of lawful sex tourism. And when sex tourism happens within lawful channels, this does not qualify as trafficking, right? I know there's a lot of reaction to that, and I don't necessarily abide to that, but I'm just saying that you could argue that if sex tourism happens in a lawful manner, let me put a disclaimer here, would never involve minors, okay, just putting it out there. And it would not constitute trafficking because it would also require the consent, right? But where we see a very big overlapping is where we have what we call the sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. This is the term that has replaced the former term child sex trafficking. We find that this is not not appropriate to be used anymore. So we use SECT, which is sexual exploitation of children in tourism and travel. In 2012, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Sale of Children dedicated her full annual report on the exploitation of children in travel and tourism, and it has very interesting findings for our audience to go and look at. That was the 2012, and also I mentioned Polaris, the US NGO, and there's another association of NGOs that's called EKPAT, which is an association of 100 NGOs from over 90 countries that are doing considerable research globally and regionally on the prevalence of trafficking in human beings in travel and tourism, and the sexual exploitation of children. And it is interesting to read the regional reports here. So for example, they see that trafficking has a different prevalence in different regions. So it's in Southeast Asia, for example, what we see as a trend is that there is a lot of intra-regional trafficking. So not traffickers, clients, customers, or users are traveling to specific destinations to engage in sexual exploitation of children, for example, that have been trafficked to those hot spots, if you want, from another place. And when we want, as I said, trafficking requires the travel of the person, requires that the person has been transferred from one place to another, right? This transfer does not require the crossing of the borders. It can happen within the same country. So that's interesting, because in the past, it used to be perceived that you have to cross the borders and all of that, and that is why it was a gray area between illegal migration and trafficking. And then, but on the other hand, we see in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we have unique settings where we have prevalence of trafficking, such as the volunteering tourism settings, or the military bases, or the peacekeeping missions. So you see that in every region we have different features. So let me go on to the regulatory framework really quickly, because I see I don't have a lot of time in front of me. Sorry to taking longer. As I said, we have the UN protocol, and the UN protocol has been adopted by 174 states. And yes, it's not great in terms of victims protection, but it does set a lot of obligations to states. So what do the states have to do? They have to criminalize trafficking in all its forms. That means they have to put in place the right laws. They have to put in place the right enforcement mechanisms. They have to put in place the right training of everyone involved, from the border officers to the judges to the prosecutors to all of these people that come in contact with trafficking victims or potential trafficking victims. So there are very clear set of obligations there. The problem with the trafficking protocol is it doesn't have a monitoring mechanism. That is an issue, but that issue is resolved kind of with the monitoring mechanism that the international human rights legal instruments have. And trafficking is not literally explicitly provided in any of the big and the core international human rights law instruments, but it is covered within the scope. So it is covered when the European Convention on Human Rights in Article 4 prohibits slavery and forced labor and servitude, and that was recognized by the European Court of Human Rights for the first time in 2005 in the case of Siliadin against France. And the jurisprudence of the court continues to be developed. And then we've also, it is also covered by, for example, the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, by the Labor Conventions of the ILO, and so on and so forth. So those human rights instruments are extremely helpful because they cover the gaps of the trafficking protocols, in that they step in and they interpret and they tell states what they have to do to comply with their obligations under the convention. And particularly so for the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights and the European Court for Human Rights, who are not just monitoring mechanisms, they are also proper courts. So they try states who have violated their obligations under the convention, and we have seen states falling within that scope, and we have seen trafficking cases reaching both courts, the Inter-American and the European Court of Human Rights. And I know that I have to stop here, if that's okay, or I know you may have questions later, and I had a few more things to say, but I think it's better if I stop and I give the floor to someone else. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tenia.